Mic test. Mic test. Good morning, everyone. Let's start this day with a prayer. We praise you, O God. You are the one at work in our lives and you really value us wherever we are. Thank you for your love for us. So help us to love you. Take care of us. Give us good internet connection. Give us wisdom as we study. Provide for us, protect us, and lead us. Help us to walk in your light always. Take care of us and our loved ones. You're wonderful, God, to us. Thank you so much. All these we pray in Christ's name. Amen. Good morning, class. So, could you please type an emoji that reflects your feeling today? Okay, some are still sleepy. So, today we'll discuss Krashen's five hypotheses. Krashen's five hypotheses are under the Initist school of thought. And the Initist school of thought believes that it's the brain that drives language learning with minimal input from the environment. So the first hypothesis is acquisition learning distinction. Acquisition learning distinction. The idea is there's a difference between subconsciously acquiring the language versus consciously learning the rules. Acquisition is like when you learn a language naturally, and learning is when you learn a language in school with all the rules that you hear. So, acquisition is a process similar to the way young children learn their first language. So, when children learn their own language, their first language, they do not learn it through rules. Children are not taught the SVA, the subject verb agreement, explicitly. Oh, when the subject is singular, the verb should be plural, something like that. They don't have that. They learn language subconsciously. They don't try to learn language consciously. Rather, they use language to communicate, and then when that happens, they acquire the language. They acquire the language by using it for communication. So, acquisition is a process similar to the way young children learn their first language. Acquisition is subconscious. Learners are not aware that they are acquiring language but are using it for communication. It's like learning to balance in a bicycle. You cannot balance yourself by applying the rules. Rather, you get a feel for your balance. Class, I was teaching my son to ride a bicycle, but for a long time he couldn't balance himself. And then all of a sudden, he could balance himself. So it's subconscious. He didn't learn to balance himself by applying rules, rather by getting a feel for it. Similarly, you learn language subconsciously. Not learn, you acquire language. Again, you acquire language subconsciously. So for Krashen, there's a distinction between acquisition and learning. Acquiring a language is subconscious. Learners are not aware that they're acquiring language but are using it for communication. So how do you learn to ride a bike? How do you learn to balance yourself? By trying to balance yourself. So acquisition is implicit learning, it's informal learning, and natural learning, picking up a language. Adults can also acquire this ability. Acquiring a language does not end at puberty, but it does not mean adults will always achieve native like fluency. But adults can also access the language acquisition device. So let's pause for those taking notes. Again, acquisition is implicit learning, it's informal learning, and natural learning. It's picking up a language. Adults can also acquire. Acquisition does not end at puberty, but it does not mean that adults will always achieve native like fluency. Now, adults can also access the language acquisition device, but remember, the language acquisition device grows old, it atrophies, it deteriorates. So it's not quality. Adults can also acquire. This ability does not end at puberty, but it does not mean adults will always achieve native like fluency. Adults can also access the language acquisition device. Now, according to Anatists, error correction has little effect on acquisition. I discovered that with my young daughter. So my daughter would say, nagkain. And then I said, it should be kumain, not nagkain. And then she would say, nagkumain. So even though I correct her grammar, my correction on her grammar has very little effect. Maybe when she's watching her language, yes, she could use the correct grammar. But when she is focusing on communication, when she's depending on her own communicative competence, then all those grammar errors come up. And so even if we correct grammar, it has little effect on acquisition. By the way, class, in Inatism, it's acquiring grammar that is the primary consideration. According to Initis, if you acquire grammar, you acquire the language. But for acquisition, which is a subconscious process, error correction has little effect. In the same way, even if you tell your friend how to balance herself, himself, she won't, be able to balance herself. Even if you try to correct her, it's really up to her how to balance herself. It's a subconscious process. In fact, researchers like Brown and company found that parents correct only a small portion of children's language, and these include occasional pronunciation problems, certain verbs, and dirty words. So researchers like Brown and his colleagues found that parents correct only a small portion of children's language. These include occasional pronunciation problems, certain verbs, and dirty words. Let's pause for those taking notes. So I hope you could come back to this video to try to complete your notes. So parents correct only a small portion of children's language. So according to them, parents attend far more to the truth value of what the child is saying rather than to the form. So for example, when a child says, her curl my hair, parents don't correct that grammar. But when a child says, Walt Disney comes on Tuesdays, that's the time they correct it. Walt Disney comes, no honey, Walt Disney comes on Wednesdays. So it's the truth value that's usually corrected, not really the grammar. So parents attend far more to the truth value of what the child is saying rather than to the form. So when a child says her curl my hair, the child doesn't the parents do not correct the grammar, but the parents correct the truth value of a child's utterances. Like when a child mistakenly says Walt Disney comes on Tuesdays, parents, for example, would correct them saying, no, honey, Walt Disney comes on Wednesdays. So we have that. Remember the hypothesis, the first hypothesis, there's a difference between acquisition and learning. Learning is conscious knowledge of rules. Learning is knowing about. It's explicit learning. And according to researchers, error correction supposedly has an effect on learning. Because learning is conscious knowledge of rules. It's knowing about, it's explicit learning. And error correction supposedly has an effect on learning. For example, he has a car, hasn't he? Or he has a car, doesn't he? Can you type the correct tag question on the comment section, on the chat? Sorry, on the chat. He has a car, hasn't he? He has a car, doesn't he? Okay, so thank you. The correct answer is doesn't he? Because has here is not an auxiliary verb. So when it comes to conscious learning of rules, we can correct those conscious understanding of the rules. The second hypothesis is natural order. The acquisition of grammar structures proceeds in a predictable order. That's why we have the life cycle of a butterfly here. Acquisition of grammatical structures proceeds in a predictable order. Take note, class, it's acquisition, not learning. Again, it's acquisition of grammatical structures that proceed in a predictable order, not learning. Acquisition of grammatical structures proceeds in a predictable order. No matter what your first language is, all language learners go through the same stages. Whether you're Korean, Arab, Filipino, whether your first language is Korean, Arabic, Filipino, German, Eskimo, when you try to learn English, all these language learners go through the same stages of language learning, of language acquisition. So even whatever your first language is, when you try to learn English, you go through the same stages as other language learners. So just like a butterfly, all butterflies go through the same stages. They start out as an egg, then they become a caterpillar, then they become a pupa, eventually they become a butterfly. So Initists think of language as an organism, and all language learners go through the same stages in learning English and other languages. So, according to Initists and to Krashen, acquirers of a given language tend to acquire certain grammatical structures early and others later. So there are grammatical structures that are acquired early and others later. I think one of them is the passive. In a passive sentence, the subject is the receiver of the action. Like, the sandwich was eaten by my friend. The window was closed by the teacher. The car was driven to Chicago. The pen was used to write an essay. So if you say John hit Carl, that's active. But if you say Carl was hit by John, that's passive. Now, class, according to researchers, young children have not would not be able to acquire passives. They would always use the active voice. Passive is acquired at around grade 6. So passives are acquired much later than active voice. Now, maybe you can teach children to use the passive when they are consciously paying attention to their language. When they're consciously paying attention to the form of their language, maybe yes, they can pronounce, they can say, they can utter passives. But when they revert back to their competence, like when they focus on communication, they go back to active. Let me just turn on my phone. So, ac- um, acquirers of a given language tend to acquire certain grammatical structures early and others later. So you go through the same stages. And here is an example of the grammar rules that are required. Not the grammar rules, the grammar the grammatical structures. Okay? So according to Dulay and Burt, whatever your first language is, this is what you would go through. First, you learn the case and you learn the word order. Then at stage 2, you learn the singular copula, the is. Okay, you also learn the plural auxiliary, the are, and the progressive ing. And then at stage 3, no matter what your first language is, this is where you acquire the past irregular, the possessive, the third person singular, would, and the long plural s. And then at stage 4, you learn have plus n, have eaten, have taken. So whatever your first language is, these are the stages you pass through. So according to researchers, the agreement among individual acquirers is not always 100%, but there are clear statistically significant similarities. So language learners all go through similar stages. They all go through similar stages. The agreement among individual acquirers is not always 100%, but there are clear statistically significant similarities. So that's the second hypothesis, that language goes through a natural order. Language learning goes through natural order. Or language acquisition, sorry. Language acquisition goes through a predictable order. Acquisition goes through a natural, predictable order. Then we have the third hypothesis, the monitor hypothesis. The idea is you watch your language, you monitor your speech, you monitor your form. So, from what you have internalized, you try to utter something, and what you try to utter, you try to monitor. Okay, what the acquired competence that you have, you use the conscious rules that you know in order to modify what you're going to say. Now, that is evidenced, class, by people correcting their own speech. When they correct their own speech, did you went? I mean, go here. Did you come here? Did you went? I mean, go. I mean, come here. Did you come here? Or sometimes when somebody pauses in order to try to find out the correct structure. So why did he come come here? Why did he went here? I mean, come here. That's the monitor hypothesis. When you watch the form of your language, again, the monitor hypothesis is about watching your language, paying attention to the form of your language. And the monitor is used only when three conditions are present. You watch your language only when three conditions are present. First, there should be enough time. Because if there's not enough time, then you won't be able to watch your language. Second, when you are focusing on the form of your language, that's the time that you monitor your speech. But if you're focusing on communication, when you are bothered by something, you're not paying attention to the form of your language, that's the time that you use the monitor. You don't use the monitor. When you focus on communication, you're bothered. You're not thinking about the form of your language. Then you don't use the monitor. But when you focus on the form, that's the time that you use the monitor. And of course, you should consciously know the rules. If you don't consciously know the rule, how can you apply the rule? You cannot apply the rule if you don't consciously know the rule. So you should know the rule about did and does, what form of the verb is taken when you have did and does, when you focus on the form, and when you have time. So the monitor enables speakers to use forms that are not yet acquired. So for example, in my case, I have not really acquired tag questions. Class, I have not acquired tag questions. I have learned tag questions, but I have not acquired tag questions. When I monitor my speech, that's the time that I'm able to say, he is here, isn't he? He is here, isn't he? But when I do not focus on the form of my language, when I focus on communication, when I don't monitor my speech, I end up saying, he is here, is he? He is here, is he? Which is wrong. As I told you, class, I have not acquired tag questions. I have learned tag questions, but I have not acquired tag questions. When I'm monitoring my speech, I say, he is here, isn't he? But when I focus on communication, I would say, he is here, is he? So the monitor, because I am consciously knowledgeable about the rules, I am able to use the correct form that I have not yet acquired. So when I monitor my speech based on the rules that I explicitly, consciously know, that's the time that I am able to use the correct forms that are not yet acquired. And there are three types of monitor users. The first one is the overuser. The overuser may be too exposed to grammar teaching, and they are insecure about trusting the acquired system, what they internally know. Let me pause for those taking notes. The overuser may be too exposed to grammar teaching, and they are insecure about trusting the acquired system that they have. Class, according to a visiting lecturer from the US Embassy, examples of overusers are the Japanese. When the Japanese speak English, they pause a lot in order to monitor their speech. So they would say, I was am going to to the embassy. So they monitor their speech a lot. Then there are the underusers. They rely completely on acquired system. They don't monitor their speech. They don't care about the grammar rules much. They rely completely on what they have acquired, not what they'll have learned. The underuser relies completely on acquired system. And class, according to the same visiting lecturer from the US Embassy, examples of these are Latino speakers. Latino speakers. They would talk and 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 talk. They do not care about the form of their language very much. They don't try to apply rules. They are underusers. And then we have the optimal users. And it's only when necessary to produce the correct form without impeding communication. They use the monitor only when necessary to produce the correct form without impeding communication. So they monitor only when it does not impede communication. The whole point is not impeding the communication. If impedes the communication, then they don't monitor. But they monitor in order to produce the correct form. But that should not impede communication. Okay, so optimal users use the monitor only when necessary to produce the correct form without impeding communication. So again, the overuser may be too exposed to grammar teaching. They are insecure about trusting acquired system. And according to a lecturer, examples are the Japanese. We also have an underuser. They rely completely on the acquired system. Maybe, according to the same professor, examples are Latino learners of English. And then we have the optimal users. They use the monitor only when necessary to produce the correct form without impeding communication. And then we have the fourth hypothesis. It's called the input hypothesis. But at this point, I would like for us to take a 10-minute break. So see you at 8:17. Hey Siri, what time is it? Oh no. Okay, hello again, class. Could you give a signal that you are here? Okay, thank you. So, the fourth hypothesis is the input hypothesis. According to Krashen, a learner acquires a language through comprehensible input. So, I'm going to pause to wait for you to write that. That's very important. A learner acquires a language through comprehensible input. A learner acquires a language through comprehensible input. Class, if you are stuck in an island and you have a radio that's stuck to a Chinese station, even if you listen to it for years, you will not acquire language. Again, if you listen to input that's not provided with extra linguistic information, then you will not acquire it. On the other hand, when you listen to input and you have other clues as to the meaning of it, that's the time that it becomes what is called comprehensible input. It becomes what is becomes what is becomes what is mic testing. Mic testing. Okay. So input the language. input should have other clues as to what it means. That's what we mean by comprehensible input. So, class, if this was face to face, this is the point where I would ask you, where I would signal like this, and then say, Java, Java. So, this is Burmese. So, I would give you an example of comprehensible input. I will teach you three words in Burmese without actually telling you what they mean. Again, I will teach you three words in Burmese without telling you explicitly what they mean. I'll just provide comprehensible input. So I will signal like this. I would signal like this. And then I would say, Tiaba, Tiaba, Tiaba. And all of you would stand up. And then I would say something like this. And I would act like this. I would give this gesture and say, Taiba, 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 Taiba. And then again, I would ask you to I would say Chaba, 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 Chaba. And then I would tell you, I would say Taiba and doing this at the same time. Taiba and then doing this at the same time. Taiba. Lebadba, sorry. I would say I would do this and say Lebadba. Let me just check my phone. Fix my phone. Mic test. 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 There. So I would say Chaba. I would say Taiba. I would say Chaba. And then I would say Lebadba. 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 And then I would call one of you and say Chaba, Taiba, Lebadba. And eventually you will understand what Chaba, Taiba, and Lebadba mean without me actually telling you what they actually mean. That's an example of comprehensible input. Input with other clues, with what is called extra linguistic information. Okay? Class, comprehensible input is I plus 1. I here is what you actually know. I here is what you have acquired. Plus 1 is the set of skills, language skills that are just a little bit beyond what you already know. So I plus 1 is comprehensible input. I plus 1 refers to the set of skills that are just beyond what you already know. And what do you call that? What is the term used in your prof ed courses to refer to that set of skills that are just a little beyond your actual set of skills? Type it in the comment. Type it in the comment. What are those set of skills that are just a little beyond your skills? What is the term used for that in your prof ed courses? I'll give you a clue. It came from Lev Vygotsky. It came from Lev Vygotsky. Type it into the comment. What is the term used by Lev Vygotsky to refer to the set of skills that are just a little beyond your set of skills? Okay? It's called the zone of proximal development or ZOPED. So I plus 1 is very similar to Lev Vygotsky's zone of proximal development or ZOPED. And this zone contains content that is just a little beyond a learner's capability. Again, the I plus 1 or ZOPED is the zone that contains content that is just a little beyond a learner's capability. The ZOPED is the zone that contains content that is just a little beyond a learner's capability. That's the ZOPED. The set of actual skills that you know, the set of skills that you actually know is called the zone of actual development. So you have the zone of actual development and you also have the zone of proximal development. Class, the word proximal means near, just a little beyond your set of skills. That's I plus 1. I plus 1 is comprehensible input. And this content cannot be learned by a learner through practice, but only through aid from a much more knowledgeable person. Again, these sets of skills are not something you can learn through practice. You need aid from a much more knowledgeable person. So, class, it's at this point, I might include this in the quiz, okay? It's at this point where I will tell the story about my mom. You know, my mom was also an English teacher in PNU. And back in the 1970s, they did not have TV, they did not have movies, they did not have Sesame Street. So my mom, uh, they learned English through textbooks. So my mom and her colleagues had a problem. Again, I'll give this in the quiz. My mom and her colleagues did not know the English word for aray. Now, in our case, class, because we watch movies, we see we see people saying the English word for aray. But you see, class, my mom and her colleagues, they learn their English through textbooks. And in the textbooks, there's no indication of the English word for aray. And no matter how they practiced, they would not know the English word for aray. Okay? The Tagalog word for ouch is aray. We know ouch. We know the English word for aray, ouch, because we watch movies and TV and we see it there. But my mom and her colleagues didn't have TV at that time. And so they learn their English only in textbooks, but in textbooks they don't have the word aray. And no matter how they practice, they would not be able to learn or acquire or know the English word for aray. They even invented their own words, what they thought the English word for aray was, like array or aroy, array, aroy. Okay, and even though they practiced, they would not learn. They could not learn the English word for aray. Okay, that's what we mean when we say this content cannot be learned by a learner through practice, but only through aid from a much more knowledgeable person. So this is where Lev Vygotsky and Stephen Krashen intersect. Okay, now class, again, for the behaviorist view, you learn the structure and then you practice, which is not the same with innetism. So ayun, sinulat pala ni Sam Guanzon. Very good, Sam. Sam Guanzon. Now, again, class, if we review the behaviorist view, you have structure. You learn the structure and then you practice. You learn the form. You practice the form even though it's not meaningful. Like when you say, I'm going to the mall, I'm going to the city hall, I'm going to the clinic, I'm going to the zoo. So it's a practice of the form, but it's not really meaningful. You're not really using language for communication. You're practicing the form. That's the behaviorist view: structure, then practice, which is different from innetism. In the input hypothesis, what you do is you go for meaning to acquire structure. Going for meaning to acquire structure. Going for meaning to acquire structure. Class, language learning is very counterintuitive. You see, in other human behavior, you really practice. You want to learn to dance, you practice dance. But in language, it's not practicing the form that makes you acquire the meaning. Rather, you go for the meaning to acquire the structure. In order for you to learn the structure, in order for you to learn the form, in order for you to, sorry, let's use the word acquire. In order for you to acquire the form, in order for you to acquire the structure, you have to use language for communication, for meaningful communication. For meaningful communication. You go for the meaning in order to learn the structure. You don't practice the structure to acquire the structure. Rather, you go for meaning to acquire the structure. That's what I mean when I say language learning is very counterintuitive. Here's our statement of the input hypothesis. The input hypothesis relates to acquisition, not learning. Please copy that. So the input hypothesis relates to acquisition, not learning. And we acquire by understanding language that contains structure a bit beyond our current level of competence, or what we call I plus one. This is done with the help of content or extra linguistic information. This is done with the help of context or extra linguistic information. That's why we have the chaba, chaba, naiba, lebadba. Okay, so I will pause to let you copy this. Mic testing, mic testing, mic testing. Okay. We acquire by understanding language that contains structure a bit beyond our current level of competence. As I plus one, this is done with the help of context or extra linguistic information. Number three, input must contain I plus one to be useful for language acquisition, but it need not contain only I plus one. It need not contain only I plus one. So let me pause to let those taking notes be able to take notes. Input must contain I plus 1 to be useful for language acquisition, but it need not contain only I plus 1. So okay lang kahit walang I plus 1. Kahit hindi lang I plus 1. Basta may I plus 1 kahit may kasama siyang iba, okay lang. So input must contain I plus 1 to be useful for language acquisition, but it need not contain only I plus 1. Okay, I hope you're finished copying. And Krashen says, if the acquirer understands the input and there is enough of it, I plus 1 will be automatically provided. If the acquirer understands the input and there is enough of it, I plus 1 will be automatically provided. So that's the condition. The acquirer understands the input and there's enough of it. So, in other words, if communication is successful, that means I plus 1 is provided. If communication is successful, I plus 1 is provided. If communication is successful, I plus 1 is provided. So, this one is very important, class. This implies that the best input should not even attempt to deliberately aim at I plus 1. By the way, these were English majors in 2013. So, very important, the best input should not even attempt to deliberately aim at I plus 1. So, Stephen Krashen tells us that I plus 1 is necessary for language acquisition, but he does not prescribe I plus 1. Again, he does not prescribe I plus 1. He tells us that I plus 1 is needed, but he tells us not to attempt to deliberately aim at I plus 1. So, the best input should not even attempt to deliberately aim at I plus 1. A deliberate attempt to provide I plus 1 is not necessary. There is even reason to suspect that a deliberate attempt is bad or detrimental. So let me pause to let you take note. So again, a deliberate attempt to provide I plus 1 is not necessary. There's even reason to suspect that a deliberate attempt is detrimental. It's bad. According to Stephen Krashen, speaking fluency cannot be taught directly, rather, it emerges over time on its own. It's like love, class. It's like your heart. You learn to love somebody. You don't teach anyone to love you directly. Rather, it emerges over time on its own. Speaking fluency cannot be taught directly. Rather, it emerges over time on its own. Speaking fluency cannot be taught directly. Rather, it emerges over time on its own. And Krashen also says accuracy develops over time as the acquirer hears and understands more input. It's not something that you can directly teach because we're talking here about acquisition, not learning. Accuracy develops over time as the acquirer hears and understands more input. Accuracy develops over time as the acquirer hears and understands more input. So, in other words, production ability emerges. It is not taught directly, just like what we said a while ago. It emerges over time. Production ability emerges. It is not taught directly. So, we'll talk about evidences for the input hypothesis in another discussion. So, I wonder if you have any questions. Question, question, question. Okay, if there are none, then thank you very much. A good morning to every one of you. Have a nice day, and you are dismissed.